Hello there! In this video we're gonna look at what would have happened if Jango had survived episode 2. Rather than fighting against Mace Windu and having his head cut off, what would happen if he hadn't have done that and had survived? Again, this is a suggestion from not one, but I think 3 or maybe 4 of you guys. They're all on the screen now, or at least all the ones that I could find in my comments. So thanks for the suggestions, and remember to leave any suggestions of your own in the comments. Just before we start today's video, or before we start the story of today's video, because the video is definitely already started because you're watching it. Anyway, I'm now editing the video, and since I recorded it and have been editing it, we've passed 1,000 subscribers, which is amazing. From the bottom of my heart, I am so grateful to every single one of you who has clicked that subscribe button, who has supported the channel this far, and I just want to say again a huge thank you. So yeah, thank you, and let's keep going. But without further ado, let's go on with the video. We start on Geonosis, where Anakin, Obi-Wan and Padme would have just been joined in the arena by all, or at least a lot of the Jedi, the ones who had come to Geonosis. Jango would look down as the situation in the arena got more and more out of control, and then around at the Jedi who had emerged from the tunnels into the crowd. Suddenly, Coleman Trebor would appear. Instinctively, Jango would shoot him, just like in the film. Jango would look back down at the arena, and would instinctively again go to try and join the fight. However, at the last second, a thought would cross his mind. He wasn't being paid to kill Jedi, and although it would further his reputation to kill a Jedi or two, especially a member of the Council like Mace Windu, and he had already killed one Jedi today, that didn't necessarily guarantee that he would be able to do it again. And furthermore, he now had a kid to look after, which he couldn't do if he was dead. So unlike in the film, Jango would remain with Dooku and watch as the droids overwhelmed the Jedi, and then as the clones, his clones, flew in and rescued them. After Dooku had left on his Flitnot speeder bike, I did have to check Wikipedia for that name, Jango would collect Boba and leave the planet. He would intend to lie low for a while, as he would decide it probably wasn't wise making a lot of noise whilst his name was on the minds of anyone who had come into contact with or heard about the clones, as news would quickly spread that they were cloned from a bounty hunter known as Jango Fett, and Jango would be very aware that the Republic and Jedi would want to question him about, well, himself, and who had hired him to donate his DNA. So until the clones were seen as clones of one another, as opposed to clones of him, he would want to stay off the radar. So Jango and Boba would lay low for a while, moving from planet to planet to avoid unwanted attention from locals. After enough time had passed, Jango would begin taking smaller hunting jobs, still wary of the Republic and Separatists, but not as much as before. After all, Jango would know it was only a matter of time before he attracted a lot of attention. We see in the comics that Jango's main goal is to build a reputation and a legacy, and that meant the whole galaxy really had to know him. That's what his goal was. So he would know it was only a matter of time before the Republic or Separatists appeared, because they'd heard about him. And he would be right. One day, he would return to Slave One to find Dooku waiting for him. The Sith would declare that he had need for the bounty hunter, and would explain that he wanted Jango to infiltrate Kamino, pretending to be a clone and to keep an eye on things on Kamino. Dooku would do this as he wouldn't entirely trust the Kaminoans, but also wouldn't trust Sidious entirely to inform him of all the goings-on of the Republic military, and where better to get that information than from Kamino. Jango wouldn't particularly like the idea, but would know not to argue with the Sith. Dooku would explain that he was perfectly happy if Jango wanted to take other jobs during this extended mission, and then return to Kamino afterwards. Think of it as Jango living undercover some of the time on Kamino. And so Jango would infiltrate Kamino with Boba. Boba would hide with the young clones, whilst Jango would be with the adults. Jango would, when he wanted to take a job off-world, get assigned to a mission off-world and then either fake his death or just leave the clones he was with to be declared missing in action. Then he could do the job and return to Kamino to repeat the training program as a new clone. If Jango wanted Boba along as well, then both of them would just do this on one of the few times that the young clones got to leave Kamino, like we see in the Clone Wars, although this wouldn't happen very regularly, and Jango would only really bring Boba on missions when he was worried that Boba's lack of enhanced aging would be discovered, so that he would come back and start his training program as a new young clone, just like Jango was coming back as a new older clone. For quite a long time of this, nothing would really be discovered by either Jango or Boba. Jango would often report any changes to battle strategy or plans to Dooku, but nothing that Dooku wouldn't already know about through Palpatine. Jango also wouldn't find anything incriminating against the Kaminoans. However, during this time, Jango, and even more so Boba's opinion of the clone troopers stormtroopers would change. Jango would come to realize that whether he liked it or not, his biggest legacy on the galaxy would be the clone army, and so although it would be for selfish reasons, Jango would begin to care about the clones. He would also realize that they each had their own personality, and so would respect them more for that than he had before. But Boba would actually begin to make friends with the younger clones, not deep friendships, largely due to the fact that whenever he'd spent a decent length of time with any one group, he would be killed in a training incident, but friendships nonetheless, which would cause him to see the clones as his brothers to some extent. And the longer he spent on Kamino, the more his opinion of his brothers would improve, until he basically saw them as his equals. After this quite long time, Boba would begin to hear rumours of a clone who had turned against his Jedi General from the other young clones. He would tell Jango that the rumour was that there was a clone who had suddenly seemed to look as if he'd become a droid and fired on his Jedi General. He would say that apparently the clone had been brought to Kamino along with Fives, who would be a bit of a hero to the young clones following the attack on Kamino that we see in the Clone Wars. The clone that had been brought along with Fives was there to be tested. Jango would tell Boba he would report this to Dooku, to which Boba would respond that he didn't really care about what Dooku thought. He was worried about his brothers. What if the same could happen to any of them, or even Boba himself? Jango would cut Boba off, saying that they were not his brothers and that this was probably just a story that the younger clones were telling one another to try and scare each other, and it had clearly worked. Boba would initially do as Jango said, returning to life with the younger clones, trying to prevent himself forming further friendships and ignoring the talk of Fives and mind-controlled clones. But after a day or so of more and more rumours, Boba would decide he couldn't just sit idly by when his fellow clones, still trying not to call them brothers, could be in danger of basically becoming droids. He would go to investigate the rumours, convincing himself that he was doing it to find information for Dooku, but knowing full well it was actually because he cared for the other clones. And again, what if the same could happen to him? So Boba would begin to investigate, sneaking away from his training groups to go to the medical base to try and find something, but hoping that there was nothing to find, and that the rumours were all false. He would, after a few attempts, actually manage to locate Fives. Fives at this point would be undergoing some sort of medical procedure, with a droid supervising him, and so Boba would silently enter the room, deactivate the droid, implant a microphone in it, and reactivate it, quickly leaving the room, seemingly unnoticed. He would return to the barracks and begin listening to the feed coming from the microphone. After a few minutes of nothing, it would sound as though Fives had woken up. Over the next few hours, Boba would learn of chips implanted into every clone, which Fives believed would cause the clones to lose control if the chips malfunctioned. Boba would listen as Fives was discovered by Nala Se and Shaak Ti, and agreed to travel to Coruscant, at which point the droid, which Boba would find out was known as AZ, would be taken to have its memory wiped. Unfortunately, Boba wouldn't realise until it was too late that in the process of wiping the droid's memory, the microphone inside the droid would be discovered. Boba would quickly travel to find Jango when he realised this, to tell him that they needed to leave Kamino, but it would be too late. The city would be put into lockdown, trapping the two Fets inside. After briefly explaining his situation to Jango, Jango would, realising now it was not the right time to get angry with Boba, tell his son that his best chance of not being caught was to try and blend in with the other young clones, and so Boba and Jango would return to their respective barracks, where they would wait whilst an investigation into the microphone in the droid was conducted. It would be at this point, during the wait, which would take rather longer than a routine sweep, that Jango would start to consider the possibility that Boba may have actually stumbled onto something important. Eventually, the lockdown would be lifted, and Jango would proceed to his and Boba's agreed meeting location. He would wait for as long as he could without causing suspicion, until he'd have to return to his duties. After a week or so of Jango trying to find his son, he would come to accept that Boba had been discovered, and either captured or worse, and so Jango would begin an investigation of his own. To start with, he would attempt to be discreet, but after a while of making little progress, and with the ever-present fact that the longer he took, the less chance of seeing Boba again, Jango would decide to, how do I put this, utilise a wider range of his skills and arsenal. In other words, Jango would begin to interrogate Kaminoans, who he believed may have information as to what had happened during the lockdown. Jango would eventually, after asking a handful of Kaminoans what they knew, would find himself threatening Lama Su and discovering that Boba had found something far deeper than he'd he'd realised, a plot to destroy the Jedi through the use of what basically seemed to be a mind control chip, and therefore had been taken by Dooku. Jango wouldn't care much about the Jedi or this great plan to exterminate them, but he did care about Boba, and so after killing the Kaminoan Prime Minister, to prevent Jango's presence on Kamino being discovered immediately, although it would only be a matter of time before security recordings gave him away, Jango would leave Kamino in order to discover, or probably more accurately, confirm his worst fears of what had happened to Boba. Jango wasn't stupid, and so would be fully aware that Dooku probably knew that he knew about Boba, and would also know he probably stood little chance of defeating the Sith in combat, and so would decide he needed to employ some help. He would contact his fellow bounty hunters, Cad Bane, Aurra Sing, Bossk, and Dengar, and agree to meet up with them, where he would inform them of the situation and of how much he was willing to pay them. He would explain that Boba had accidentally discovered a plot to destroy the Jedi and that Dooku had captured him. He wouldn't mention the fact that Boba was likely dead, but all of the bounty hunters present would have already worked that out. And so, a few standard days later, after the munitions had been acquired by each of the crew, they would travel to Sereno, where Jango would know that Dooku was. The plan would be for them to neutralise any guards outside of Dooku's family home. Then, they would each take up their respective positions. The plan was then for them to enter from different access points, and then locate Dooku. Then, Bossk would flood the area with a Dioxis grenade, and he, Jango, and Cad Bane would go to capture the Sith, whilst Aurra provided support from range, and Dengar trapped any escape routes with non-lethal traps. Jango would want Dooku alive, as in the unlikely scenario that Boba was still alive, Jango would want to know his location, and Dooku would know that. And so, after dealing with the guards, each of them would take up their allocated location. They would quickly locate Dooku, and after a fight that wasn't without the loss of Dengar and one of Bossk's arms, they would manage to subdue Dooku. Fortunately for them, he would have been asleep when they attacked, and so it wouldn't have been too difficult to subdue him. Dooku would say that he assumed that this was about Boba, and that unfortunately the young clone was dead. And probably more unfortunate for them, in this moment, Dooku had activated his separatist distress beacon, so the Confederacy of Independent System fleet would be on their way very shortly. At this, Jango would knock Dooku out and point his blaster at the unconscious body of his former boss, master, employer. But before he could pull the trigger to end Dooku's life, he would hear Bane pull his own blaster out and would turn to see it pointed directly at him. Bane would say that there had been a change of plan and that Dooku was going to be handed over to the Republic. He would say his Republic contact had seemed rather interested in Dooku's location, even more so when he was already captured, and even more than that when Bane had mentioned this so-called plot against the Jedi that Jango had talked about earlier. The two would stand there in a stalemate for a moment until Aura's voice would come through the comms saying that they needed to get out of there as there was a Republic gunship approaching them, but it would be too late. In mere moments, troopers and two Jedi would storm the building, converging on Dooku's location. In less than a minute, dozens of clones and Bane would all be pointing their blasters at Jango, who was pointing his blaster at Dooku, whilst many other troopers would be waiting in nearby corridors. The Jedi would reach the room. We'll say the Jedi were Depa Billaba and Caleb Doom. That's Kanan from Star Wars Rebels before he changed his name to Kanan. Jango would know that if he shot Dooku, he'd be dead before the Sith even hit the floor. Well, okay, not literally because the Sith was already on the floor, because Dooku's knocked out on the floor, but you know what I mean. And the clones and Bane would know that if they shot Jango, then Dooku would be dead, along with the only person who knew anything about this supposed plot against the Jedi. And so, standing there, with whether he liked it or not, his legacy pointing blasters at him, Jango would remember that the reason Boba was dead was that he had wanted to save the clones from whatever these chips, or more specifically, those in control over the chips, did. Jango couldn't save Boba, but he could save Boba's legacy. He could try and do what Boba had wanted to do, and so slowly he would lower his blaster. Immediately, the clones would take Dooku, and along with the other bounty hunters and Caleb, leave the room, leaving Jango and Billaba in the room alone. Depa would thank Jango, saying that he had potentially saved the Republic and the Jedi if what she had heard was true, but she would continue by saying that he still needed to be taken into custody, as he had been responsible for multiple crimes against the Republic and the Jedi, but his recent decision may reduce his sentence significantly. Jango would respond, saying that he hadn't done it for the Jedi or the Republic, and without giving the Jedi Master any time to react, would draw his blaster, shooting once, and then leave the room silently, leaving Depa's body to be discovered by the clones, but then he'd be gone. Jango would then return to Slave One, knowing that his true legacy on the galaxy was firmly out of his hands. Whatever information Dooku had, the Jedi would also soon have. However that affected the clones, the Republic, the Jedi, the war, or the galaxy, he didn't know and he didn't care. What he would care about was the fact that he had hopefully played some role in helping to achieve Boba's goal, Boba's legacy on the galaxy, whether he believed in it or not. And with that, he would take off to find another job for another client, maybe this time someone not quite as involved in politics. And back on Coruscant, after much persuasion and many investigations of his home on Sereno to find any clues, Dooku's secrets would be discovered. The chip, Order 66, Palpatine's true intentions and identity, and the Jedi and the Republic would survive, with the clones never executing Order 66. And that's about it. That's how I see Star Wars going if Jango hadn't died in Attack of the Clones when Mace Windu cut his head off. But that's just my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments, along with anything else. Remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and do anything else that you're supposed to do on YouTube. But that's about it. Thanks for watching. Bye!